when you're tweeting something out or saying something in a comment section, you're not putting as much thought into it or considering what sort of impact that has. I know one thing for sure is that people have their own algorithms. One person watches CNN, one person watches Fox, one person gets their news from their Twitter feed, one person doesn't have social media at all, and they have very different realities and outlooks on what's going on.
Do you think misinformation or people getting inaccurate information is the biggest problem in our politics today, or is it something else?
Yeah, I would say so.
So from your experience, what is, I guess, the antidote to that? How have you combated that inability to get good information?
Yeah, you have to be...
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Howdy, folks. How you doing? Today's a really exciting episode of the podcast because today I've got Tony Vanderhoef on, and we're going to be talking about the American political experience. We're talking about how you sort of get sucked into rabbit holes and partisanism and the cultural divide. And I will warn you, we're going to talk about some nitty-gritty, political philosophy things. If you watch, I'll try and put in some notes and things in the video, so you'll be able to see, okay, here's the full text of this thing that they're quoting. Here's, a fact check. There's a couple times I'll fact check what we're saying in the video, so you'll actually get to read the fact check in there. So if you want that in the episode, feel free to go watch the episode. You'll get that in there. Obviously, you won't get that in the audio version. You'll have to just experience it. You'll have to just pay attention. It is a little bit more jargon heavy than other episodes that you listen to, just because we're talking about legislation. Tony will mention some court cases and things and reference that. He's a constitutional law scholar. So there's a little bit more jargon in this episode than what you'd be normally used to. So bear that in mind. This will be really fun. Tony Vanderhoef is, like I mentioned, a constitutional law scholar. He's been creating content on social media about the American political experience, about this idea that we're separated and sort of what's happened to the parties. He's done a great job on social media. If you don't follow him now, you probably should. He makes some great content. I'm excited to get into this conversation. I think it's one of the better ones we've had here on the show, so I can't wait to share it with you. Without any further ado, Tony Vanderhoef. Tony Vanderhoef, welcome to Compendium. Thanks so much for coming on, man.
Absolutely, Josh. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
You said in a recent post, political division is an illusion. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so the purpose of that video was to capture the idea that polarization is very much a real thing. But when you sort of look behind the curtain, we're actually sort of unified on a lot of important subjects and in our desire for both sides to sort of compromise and find ways to work together. I sort of used the sort of throwback now of the 2012 election between Obama and Romney and how they shook hands after the debate and, shared some words there and smiled to the crowd. And that today feels very much like a sentiment that's of the past. And especially in the social media age, we feel increasingly divided. In the comment sections, people are often going at each other's throats over politics and the like. And sort of that video, I wanted to just sort of talk about those things, touch on it, but also point at the fact that like over 73% of voters, and depending on the poll, 80% support like voter ID laws, for example. And that's something that sort of gets lost in the political process. And that's just one example of many. And that there is this desire for us to come and work together and find ways to make politics unified in some way. But also, making light of the fact that polarization is not new. It's in our nature. We're prone to be tribal. And that's things we have to just be mindful of, be accepting of even, and find ways to work around that. So,
do you think it is a feature or a bug, the political, or is it just sort of like, so, and I guess when I'm thinking about it,
yeah,
democracy bakes some of this in. Somebody I was talking to described it as a feedback loop. Like some of this
Absolutely.
divisiveness is just kind of and they described it as a good thing. They say
Yeah.
democracy has this baked-in feedback loop that it's its benefit against, if you're comparing it to like an authoritarian regime that has no feedback. But on the
Correct.
flip side, right, it's chaotic and messy. So
Absolutely.
taking all of that in, is this division a feature or a bug to you?
I think it's very much a feature. If you read the Federalist Papers and you see, you just read the writings of the various founding fathers, they designed the system for separation of powers to sort of uh, safeguard against that. Um, but they also built a bicameral government. So you have two sides that have to work together and create friction. And they work on behalf of the American people who have to vote them in. They were very wary of political parties, which I think have very much become an influence they couldn't have expected, especially today on the political process. Um, but with that said, I don't think division is new. It's always been there. I mean, just look, we had a civil war, for example. Uh, but I think that social media has sort of exacerbated the worst in our qualities when it comes to tribalism, polarization, and the like. And that's sort of what we're dealing with now, and which is exactly what encouraged me to start doing content to talk about things like this.
In the lead up to the Civil War, there's th- there's a division that's a little bit different. They call it
Yeah.
sectionalism, where you have North and South that they're just very different, um, politically speaking. Like the average Joe is pretty similar, but from a politics perspective, they get very, very divided, and they just start calling them the North section and the South section. Do you think that there's any kind of sectionalism happening? It's obviously not going to be a geographical sort of a thing because it's much more
Right.
ideological if there is anything like that. But is it more of a just partisan divide that, if we have a unifying figure or set of figures, then maybe this will be figured out, or is it like a true sectionalism along party lines?
I think there's probably several different ways you could slice that or different directions you could take it. I know one thing for sure is that people have their own algorithms and they're exposed to media and content and news in a very different way than maybe someone else they're going to school with or they work with or even people within their family. I've experienced this in my personal life. And back on like working in political campaigns, I saw that just politically across the spectrum with going door to door and talking to people. And one person watches CNN, one person watches Fox, one person gets their news from their Twitter feed, one person doesn't have social media at all. And they have very different realities and outlooks on what's going on, both in their community and nationally. So if I had to say, I would think the sections are probably more niche and more diverse and spread out, and it's based on where they're getting their information from. Um, and so that's sort of my first instinct there. But it wouldn't surprise me to see discrepancies in political beliefs, ideologies, and policies that someone supports based on if they're coastal or college educated. I think there's a lot of polls that show differences there. Like the Democratic Party or the left tends to be more educated. They're more likely to have gone to like graduate school and things like that. So we see that. In the right tends to be more working class, people living in rural city centers versus urban, stuff like that. But I think how that plays out today in a modern context is very different than how it was pre-Civil War for obvious reasons. A lot has changed since then, and social media, technology, phones, all of that. But with that said, I think the technology and stuff now, it's keeping that polarization and division in front of our faces at our fingertips 24/7, which is different than how it was back then. Before, you only were exposed to that like on the street corner with someone on a soapbox or something, literally going and ranting, or some pamphlet that gets handed out, right? Instead, now you're getting notifications on your phone every second and watching the news on the TV and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's my
Yeah,
thoughts there.
I wrote something probably a year ago, and I can't remember the specific context that I used this, but um, I think it was comparing. There was this fire eater, William Yancey, who he built a platform in the South pre-Civil War on division. He has this quote at I want to say it's the Democratic Convention in Charleston in 1860, where he's basically talking about how he wants to provide fuel for the fire, essentially. I went back and was writing this thing talking about how, he, built this platform meant to exacerbate tensions. But he only delivered, hundreds of speeches in his political career, which, hundreds of speeches. He was getting around. He was talking a lot. He was stumping for things.
Right.
But I then went and looked, and I think Donald Trump had tweeted like 60,000 times. And
Wow.
it's just like, William Yancey was able to deliver a message to an audience hundreds of times. And, a speech is obviously different than a tweet, but still, you've got this access to political figures, and they're able to wade into a lot more discourse than, somebody in the 1800s who's, their only access to political discourse is at a debate or going to a convention or delivering a speech or, some sort of community event. And I
Right.
was just wondering, like, I don't have an answer for this, but it does seem like quality or quantity has sort of taken a quality all of its own where, I mean, this is just so vastly different. And I don't know if it's, a terrible thing. It kind of sounds a little scary, but I don't know. It's just so odd, I guess, to put things in perspective. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
the politicians they have direct access to people in a way that really has never been the case before.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating point. There's a lot of ways you could sort of take that, but it's almost like that's like 60,000 mini speeches, if you will. And
Yeah.
also the concern there is when you're tweeting something out or saying something in a comment section, you're not putting as much thought into it or considering what sort of impact that has. Whereas back in the day, when you're going to conventions or you're doing a speech, you've had some time to think it through. You've considered alternative viewpoints. You've thought things, through to the point where you have a good idea of where it comes from and what you're relying on to say those things. Whereas today, you're able to just quickly spit things out. And the incentive structure currently exists where you get rewarded for the more that you pump out. And the more you exacerbate that tribal nature and the division that exists, the more you can sort of elevate yourself. And modern populism is really fed off of that. And I think that's why we're seeing more of the extremes on each side sort of rise, because they're more willing to come and take a stand. And when you do that, yeah, it's black and white, which is usually, you would think it's harder because you make more enemies by doing that, by taking like a stark stance on things. But you also build very passionate supporters. And especially now where you have public trust that has collapsed since the Eisenhower era, like 1958, towards the end of the Eisenhower administration, public trust in government was at 73%. That's almost unheard of today. Today, it's around 17%. Okay. And I think with that, you have people that are hungry for voices that even if they're not perfect, if they at least sound genuine, people will latch on to that. Or if they're able to speak to things that are important to them, which is something that a Trump or a Mamdani do very well, they're going to get very passionate supporters and sort of build a cult following behind them that then makes them very successful politically. And then for better or for worse, those are the sort of people that we're seeing rise in modern American politics today.
Which is terrifying.
I agree. And that's, yeah.
Like partisan conversations aside, the cult of personalities that develop, to me, in my mind, in situations like that, you are almost handing over. You're putting trust in a human, and in my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, as the constitutional law scholar you are, in my mind, the entire thing is set up to prevent trust in any one person. It doesn't matter who the
Correct.
person is, but it's
No.
all of these institutions put in place to sort of make things difficult for any one person to change things all that much.
Correct. Yeah. And I mean, we the people, that's an instrumental part of the idea behind the Constitution, behind the idea of self-governance. My favorite, quote from the Federalist Papers comes from James Madison, number 51. What is government but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? And I think in that it's inherent that these institutions, the parties, the representatives among us who we elect to represent us are reflections of us for better or for worse. And it's upon us it's our responsibility to ensure that those people we elect and those institutions that they help create and run reflect the best in our nature. Fortunately, so often they represent the worst. But thankfully, we still have the longest lasting, constitution that's ever been written, as far as we know, in recent record, anyways. And I think it's because it's afforded us enough flexibility to change and adapt over time. And we still have that as a mechanism to sort of safeguard those rights and to hopefully reel in the trends that we're starting to see. The issue is, though, is they worried about political parties for this reason. But as I'm learning now through my constitutional law studies, is that partisanship almost kicked in literally immediately. You have like fights going on about the national banks at the time, back in the early part of them carrying out our sort of the operations of the government soon after the Constitution was finally implemented. And just as an example, and so it sort of unleashed a thing that was probably always going to happen no matter how you design the Constitution, because it's within our nature. Going back to in politics, Aristotle talks about how we're political animals. And I just think the desire to be political, to create community and society, it's just part of our nature and it's inescapable. But it also creates that intractable sort of challenge to how do we create a system, that's good enough to afford sort of a civilized society that can, render us a world that's habitable and sustainable and hopefully abundant for as many people as possible, but also, safeguard that against it getting torn apart by polarization or conflict or corruption. And so, yeah, there's a lot there. And that's why it's important. And right now, I think the cult of personalities that we're dealing with are actually quite mild to what they could be. If we look at history as an example, like, Nazi Germany, for example. And what's crazy is that's not that long ago. We act like it is, but a lot of those beliefs that led to that happening in the first place and that gave someone like a Hitler sort of the fuel to rise, those ideas, we're still seeing them today. They're all across social media again. And that just goes to show that we're not different. Human nature hasn't suddenly changed. We haven't evolved that much in such a short time. And I think we need to keep that in mind and sort of have a careful, safe, way in which we operate, going forward, and hopefully find ways that we can sort of come together and reel in sort of executive power and the expansion of the administrative state and so on. So.
Was there an inciting incident for you to get into political discourse or something that was a jumping off point for you?
I would say the pandemic, because I think that forced a lot of people to sort of be introspective, because the world in a way was sort of shut down. We were stuck in our homes for an extended period of time. A lot of people weren't working or going to school or whatever. And we were increasingly online. And so I think we got to see in real time the negative effects that can sort of have on us, the spread of disinformation, misinformation, and stuff like that. And it also sort of exposed our distrust in our government. And to be fair, I think it's sort of a bipartisan agreement at this point that they didn't handle it the best. But at the same time, I think they truly were doing the best that they could given the circumstances. For example, there was the whole mask argument. The first few weeks when that was rolling out, I think like in March, they were saying, oh, don't worry about buying all the masks and stuff like that. And then it turns out, there was these mask mandates for a while, and then they justified that by saying, oh, we were just trying to reserve enough for, the first responders and people working in hospitals and stuff to make sure that they had an adequate amount, right? And so there's a lot of nuance there, which is reasonable. But I think when it's happening in real time and you have social media and all this stuff spreading information, and some of it's accurate, some of it's not, it's just easy for people to latch onto things, and they sort of fall into their echo chambers. And for me, just seeing all of that really just opened up my mind to the fact that this is really important. Where media is heading, where politics is heading. And I was a young father at the time. I had my first daughter at the time. And I was already coming back from like studying journalism and public relations and worked on political campaigns. So I already had that sort of perspective anyways. But it just sort of reminded me that this stuff can have serious consequences on everyone's life. Like that the pandemic really just impacted the world, right? And created just like lasting changes to the economy, to people's livelihoods, to public policy, public health. And that for me is what encouraged me to like go back to school and eventually go to law school, because I was interested in the regulatory and legislative process, because that impacts how the government responds to crises like that. And so for me, it's definitely the pandemic. But
Do you think misinformation or people getting inaccurate information is the biggest problem in our politics today, or is it something else?
yeah, I would say so. But for me, the core driver of that is social media, because that's where everybody's on social media. All of the news agencies are pumping out news to social media, and then the algorithms are taking that and they're spinning it everywhere. And for example, like even if you're not using, like I have an iPhone and I don't even use Apple News, but I still get like notifications from them and stuff, and it'll come randomly. And I don't even think I'm supposed to have Twitter notifications on, but I'll still get them randomly sometimes. And so it's just stuff like that. And then everybody's always on their phones, and it's just inescapable. And then when you have that sort of addicting device that's feeding you information constantly, it's just a constant drip. Oftentimes you don't know if that information is, correct. And I think that is diluting each person's understanding of the world, because it's based on faulty information at times, and people are just quick to accept it as fact, and they operate with life and talk about subjects and stuff like that based on information that may or not be true. And yeah, I would have to say that I think misinformation, disinformation, and how that plays out on social media is like the core issue with polarization today, because that's where it all stems from. And it's like adding fuel to the fire. We've talked about civil war and human nature and all of that up to this point. All of that is getting exacerbated by things like that. Just aware of the fact that not everyone knows what they're talking about. You can even be, you could be following a journalist even
Yeah.
that is maybe a news anchor on some news station you know of, or you've seen them on CNN or Fox or whatever, and they've had good talking points and they're often accurate. But you can also see them on your Instagram feed or on an Instagram story giving their thoughts real quick, which is fine. They have every right to share their thoughts, and you have every right to listen to them and form your own opinion. But they could be giving you information that's not correct. And that's a more mild example, I think, because at least they're media trained and they're plugged in. But if even they can be wrong, just imagine the random influence that you're following that's giving you their half-baked opinion. They could be way off. And then it happens instantly with social media, because it's constantly at your fingertips, and it's in your face 24/7.
It's so funny because I recently did a series of videos talking about how history is naturally biased. And
Yeah.
because I get the question all the time. In fact, I had a buddy at my house not too long ago, and he was like, "I want to read more history, but I'm worried that I'm just not going to get the truth if I read a history book."
Yeah.
And that to me is sort of symptomatic of how politics works. Like you can take that exact same problem and apply it onto politics. And the thing that I tell people to do with history books is just read competing sources, read primary
Yeah.
sources, try and understand where where the primary source is coming from. If you've got somebody writing a newspaper column in 1913, try and figure out like, okay, what's the context for why they're writing it this way? And then
Right.
if you're reading a secondary source, maybe check out the historian and see like, okay, are they trying to, what kind of history are they trying to write? Are they trying to write a Marxist history of the thing? And I mean Marxist history as in that is a type of history that is an anti-power version of
Right.
history, or
Right.
trying to give voice to marginalized groups in a history. Or is it, are they trying to argue, I don't know, fill in the blank. It can be anything.
Right.
But try and be aware of the context around what you're reading. And
Exactly.
I think with history, that's probably easier said than done because it's not happening to you in real time. I think it's
Yeah,
pretty,
exactly.
it's a probably a more straightforward process to go back and do a little bit of research and, hop into the Library of Congress and spend a couple hours diving into something. It's a little bit different with current events because current events are current. They're happening, you know, constantly, and
Right.
trying to get a grip on how or why things are happening is at times really difficult. I'm curious, your take on this and sort of take this wherever you want to go. But for me, I tend to try and find people that I understand their worldview. And I know they're going to approach every topic with this worldview, with these glasses on. And then I can listen to this person, and they might disagree, but I understand why there's disagreement. And that to me makes some of these more complicated issues a little bit more digestible because at least I know where the interpretation's coming from. And they're going to
Right.
do their research and sift through a thing, their own way. But at least I know, okay, here's how we got to where we got to. And then that allows me to sort of sift it myself and filter it through my own worldview. And typically that has helped me at least understand. And then also just like news aggregation sites that just pull in like, hey, we've got a Reuters article, we've got a Politico article, we've got, the New York Times, the Post, you know, filtering it helps a lot and figuring out like, okay, how is the right, the left, the libertarians, XYZ, how are they reporting on a thing? And
Right.
that's helped me. I don't know if you've had to approach it, that way or a different way or.
Yeah, no, those touch on a lot of great points. News aggregators like Ground News, I mean, that's one of the bigger news apps out there now. It's very accessible and they do a great job of sort of showing you how each issue is covered, by which side and so on. Getting your, news and perspectives from sources like that are great. Listening to podcasts or watching podcasts, especially ones that have just a wide variety of people that go on. I know like Rogan gets a lot of crap from people, but he has the whole gambit on and you can get a lot of different perspectives from there. So I've always loved going to there because he's introduced me to so many people in all kinds of fields, and across the political spectrum. He's had Bernie Sanders on, he's had Donald Trump on, just to give you an example, right? So the Discourse Lab, those are a couple of my buddies. That's a podcast that they run, and they do the very same thing, but more so focused on politics specifically. And they do a great job of having, all different kinds of perspectives. And so just trying to find creators and journalists and so on that are giving, airtime to different views and touching on different things and giving you just different ideas and things to consider, I think is a great thing to do, sort of just in your own way. And also, I think it's okay to consume partisan news, but you should do it from as many sides as you can. And I know people are busy and it's hard to keep up on every subject. I'm not expecting that of anyone. But I think you should make an effort to sort of see what all sides are saying, see what CNN says, and then see what Fox says about that. And you can kind of get an idea of, how you want to think about that subject, what kind of opinion you want to form. And at least you'll have a sober idea of what's actually going on. But I think it's easier and quicker to just pay attention to one side, especially because people are, I think, more prone to getting news from a source that is going to sort of confirm their own beliefs, because that just makes us feel good about ourselves, right? Because we want to feel like we're right and we have the right outlook. And of course, social media takes advantage of that and plays into that as well. So yeah, just being careful and open-minded and selective with where you get your news and your information and consume your social media content. It seems cliche and like a small thing you can do, but I think it has a huge impact on sort of your worldview if you do it the right way. And I think we need to encourage that more, for sure.
If you're comfortable sharing, what are your own politics? And you don't have to put a label
Yeah.
on it if you don't want to, but sort of how do you
Yeah.
view all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't mind at all. Before when I first started, doing like the political content and trying to bridge the divide, I kind of approached it like, oh, I have to be absolutely nonpartisan. And that's like better for the brand. But I think that's sort of not genuine if I'm doing that, because if I want to be someone that's truly in the political space and trying to encourage people to discuss, I shouldn't be scared of sharing my own ideology. But I do think I kind of, especially in a classical liberal American society, I fall within a range that is very palatable to a lot of people, especially because I consider myself a moderate, but I do fall like kind of like on a moderate right. I'm very much an Eisenhower guy. He's in my content all the time. Got a bunch of his books here. And he was a true classical liberal that tended to fall to the right. At his time, he was more of like a pragmatic Republican. And so, like, for example, he signed the 1957 and 1960 Civil Rights Acts, which were the first civil rights acts since like the Reconstruction era, during a time where that still was very unpopular with a lot of folks. And sort of that's kind of where I lean. But at the same time, that kind of makes me politically homeless these days because the current Republican Party is not at all like that. I think the spirit and the sentiment is there, but I don't think the party leadership amplifies those voices or those values at all. But at the same time, on the left, there's this sense where ideological purity is very important to them, and it has a very left lean to that right now in a modern context. So it makes me, I don't feel comfortable being able to say I fit in that way. So I'm kind of pigeonholed into having to lean to the Republican Party. But if I'm being honest, I'm not happy with either modern party. But at the same, like, to give you like background, I was raised predominantly by my grandparents. I had a rough childhood. My Nana was sort of like your hippie JFK type of Democrat. She loved the Kennedy family. My papa was like an old Dutch New Yorker. Our family fought in the Union. We come from a long line of New Yorkers that were Republican. So we're on the right side of history in that respect. And so he gravitated towards like an Eisenhower type. But yeah, I don't think either party, unfortunately, resembles those styles anymore. But I think they should, because I think they're both different iterations of the classical liberal values, like true liberalism that our nation was founded upon. And that's sort of the core ethos and mission behind my content, is to sort of highlight where we got things wrong historically, but point out where we got it right and focus on the good stuff. And that's my politics and sort of where I land. So
Are we talking like Hayekian, Burkean sort of classical liberalism? And apologies to anybody listening and thinks I might have just said
that's
Japanese.
super right.
But
That's super.
And the reason I ask is because I've been reading a lot of some of just that sphere of political thought in the past few months, and there's a billion offshoots. You got like the Oakshots and guys like that. But in my mind, I guess it's a Burkean is sort of like your foundational elements for
Yeah.
classical liberal thought, and at least so when we say classical, that's sort of where I gravitate towards or associate that with, I guess.
Yeah, that's like the super high order right from the source. I'm kind of more practical. I get my sources, at least now in my current reading, is coming from the ideas that were sort of outlined by the founders. So like a guy like Madison is very influential to me. There's a little bit of Hamilton, although Hamilton, he kind of leaned more towards a more powerful executive, which is what we're seeing now, especially like Federalist 70. And that was sort of one of the justifications for like the unitary executive, push that we saw under Reagan and Bush and the like. But I'm in a realm where I at least understand those arguments. I understand where Hamilton was coming from that. But it's interesting because at the same time, he was also like, he believed that the Constitution should be adaptable and should change over time. So yeah, it's dynamic. And so that's kind of where I'm at with like liberalism and that fact, and just the idea of free speech and liberty and those things. I think in modern politics, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And we're thinking because they got so many things wrong, like slavery and then segregation later on. And I think it's absolutely fair to call those things out for what they were, and they were flawed, and that was a failure of our leadership class at that time. But I don't think that was because of the values that the nation was founded upon. I think we were actually able to self-correct because of those values and because of the Constitution that they created. And it allowed us to sort of make up for where they fell short. And I think that is what is worth fighting for. And so it's taking those ideas and adapting them and upholding them in a modern context, without going too far to the left or right, which is, it's like a tug of war that's going on right now. And you're seeing sort of the fascistic and sort of Marxist elements and undertones that are starting to emerge in the political discourse. And that's what concerns me, is because we're seeing an executive branch and an administrative state that is growing in power. And then Congress is sort of like losing power. And that's supposed to be like our check, because we directly, elect them, and they serve just 2 and 6 year terms. And the administrative state, they can be there for a lifetime. The president can, get a good 8 years in, and there's a lot of damage you can do. And if we have these sort of cult of personalities coming up that are representing the more extremes, then the moderate, which tend to be more classically liberal, just average citizens, are getting left out of that process. And the sort of the values and the ideas that built this nation in the first place are sort of on the back burner, and they're getting diluted over time. And that's really my core concern and core motivation for doing all of this content in the first place.
I want to talk a little bit about the executive. You mentioned Federalist 70 and Hamilton. His view of the executive to me is super fascinating, because he is historically in favor of a really energetic and powerful executive branch. And
Yep.
he is in some ways on an island at the Constitutional Convention when they're trying to figure out what the executive is going to be. He is kind of, well, in a lot of ways, he's kind of by himself, because he thinks the executive should have a lot of power. But what's so interesting about him is he writes in Federalist 69 about what the actual powers are. And this is obviously after the Constitution's been ratified. This is written in 1788. But
Right.
he makes the point in almost each instance that he brings up what the executive's powers are, he compares them to what those powers would be for the monarch of Great Britain. And in each instance, he brings out that they're inferior to the king of Great Britain. And he even mentions that the executive branch would have power much more similar to the governor of New York, which is kind of a
Yeah.
foreign thing to say now, but at the time, it sort of gives you some context for what they thought the executive would be. And obviously, things change. We live in a different age. But Hamilton is this guy that thinks that the executive should be powerful, and yet I think we think about that and we think, okay, well, maybe Hamilton would have liked the way the executive turned out. I would argue he probably wouldn't. He would see this executive, or at least this, you know, period of many decades of how the executive has changed, and he'd be like, yeah, this is not exactly what we had set up. I'm curious your approach to that, and sort of how you view all that.
Yeah, I share the exact same sentiment. And I think along the way, there's been a lot of sort of stress fractures in the system, in the way that courts have ruled on these things, and specifically on like war powers and just the expansion of executive power. The modern courts have sort of avoided that under this idea of like the political question doctrine, to where that's a political question that's left to Congress or the executive itself, not to them. They don't want to impede there. And I get that, because they're trying to uphold this tradition of the separation of powers, and it's just for them to like uphold and apply the law, or to uphold the law rather than apply it. um, but I think at the same time, that is it's sort of like a leaky faucet, and now the water's starting to overflow, and that's coincided with the expansion of the administrative state. And I don't want to go too in the weeds, but there's just been several major court cases. I guess the core one is INS v. Chadha, and that was the one that sort of struck down legislative vetoes. And so, for example, in the War Powers Resolution, I think it was that's Section 5C, where it had a legislative veto that would have let at least one house that could sort of veto the president using the War Powers Resolution, so they can sort of stopgap him from, abusing that power. Chadha struck down all legislative vetoes that existed in all laws. And so now you have, in a modern context, you have it now where like a Trump can carry out, the Iran war, for example, and do so with impunity because they would have to get a supermajority in order to stop him and override his veto, because they can issue a resolution, but the president can veto it. And because of Article 1, where you have the idea of bicameralism and presentment, so they would have to pass it in both houses and present it to the president in order to override that now. Because the legislative veto before was one house could pass a resolution and stop the president from abusing the war powers. That doesn't exist anymore. And that's just like one little example of sort of the precedent that has been set. And then, of course, the administrative state now can make their own laws, adjudicate those laws, carry out their own hearings and stuff like that. And they have quasi-legislative power. And the courts have sort of sat back and let that happen. And that is something I don't think the founders could have ever imagined. And of course, these agencies exist within the executive branch. Article 2, Section 3, the Take Care Clause, the president is the one who faithfully executes the laws of the land. And if you have all of these agencies that can create their own laws, the president also gets more powerful as a byproduct of that. And then you have a Congress that no longer has that off switch, and they're sort of handcuffed to bicameralism and presentment. And I understand why those initial requirements were set, but I don't think they were sort of written at a time with this new system in mind. And so it's just an interesting time, and it makes it even more concerning with polarization and the rise of these personalities of like what that could look like over time.
There's a ton of information in there.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the Supreme Court's position, or the courts in general's position, on not applying the law but upholding the law, because applying it to war powers specifically, this is a situation that has sort of come to an impasse between Congress and the president. It is not a Trump thing. It is, Ronald Reagan, H.W. Bush both released statements that they didn't recognize the war powers resolution. Obama
Correct.
dropped bombs in Libya, citing the war powers, or citing commander-in-chief powers. Bill Clinton dropped
in Kosovo. Yeah.
Clinton did the whole Kosovo operation. There was thousands of troops involved in that. So this is not a single presidency kind of a thing. This is a rolling change over decades, and it's a bipartisan change as well. But Congress has slowly lost that battle to the executive, and in my mind, that is a situation where the courts could come in and actually apply the law a little bit. And my example would be John Marshall. And, you've got like the Indian Removal Acts with Andrew Jackson, for example. He blocked Jackson from executing Indian Removal Acts, and I think it was 1829 maybe. And he basically wrote an opinion that was like, I'd be paraphrasing here, but he basically said the Indians, we recognize them as a state, and he basically said we can't remove them. Jackson basically ignored it. He ignored the opinion and did it anyway. Yeah. So, but you have an example of, and I think John Marshall is in some respects kind of the gold standard for Supreme Court justice, but you have an example of applying the law. So I'm curious, from sort of a legislative and law perspective, why would the courts take that position for such a long period of time and sort of letting Congress and the executive kind of continue this slow, drawn-out rock fight?
Yeah, well, that could be a whole sort of...
It could be a whole podcast.
Yeah, exactly. A constitutional paper, book even, definitely a podcast. I think there is a long trend of the court attempting to defer to Congress and to the president out of respect for how the Constitution was written, and that's based on this idea of separation of powers. So in that respect, I totally get it, but I think at the same time, there are points in time where certain levers have to be pulled, certain buttons have to be pushed. I know there's like a super niche old case, Luther v. Borden, that dealt with Article 4, Section 4, which is it guarantees every state in the union a Republican form of government, something to that effect. And the court in that case also deferred and said that's a political question meant for Congress. And basically they were trying to say, does that mean that the Constitution was upholding republicanism as like a form of government? And they were saying, that's up to Congress, not us. And that was like an 1800s case, I believe, out of like Rhode Island. And so I think that's an example of that deference always existing. But in a modern sort of trend that's developed post Nixon, you have the Reagan push. That's where the unitary executive really starts to come to fruition. You have Bush, Clinton and Obama, as you pointed out. You have like these big sort of foreign policy thought leaders like Kissinger, and all of this I think is a clear trend of the military industrial complex that Eisenhower was warning about. And that's another one of those reasons why I love him so much, because he just had this grand ability to look at things from a macro perspective and see how they will play out over time. Like, for example, when he was a president at Columbia for a short while after the war, he was talking about pressure groups, which were actually special interest groups, what we call them today, and how they're influencing the political process and stuff like that. And he warned about, we famously know, the military industrial complex, which I think is what's feeding this trend that we've seen, that is using the executive, the power of the executive, to have us in a perpetual state of war. And that deference that the court has taken has sort of allowed that to happen. And Congress now is sort of handcuffed to where it doesn't really have the mechanism to do anything about it. Obviously, it has the power of the purse, so it can handle, how much military spending they get. But politically, especially nowadays where social media and everything is huge, we have radical transparency and we see everything. It's so easy for the president to say, oh, I'm doing it for X, Y, and Z reason, for humanitarian reasons. We're trying to liberate the people of Iran or Venezuela or Cuba. And the Congress comes out and says, oh, we're going to cut off funding so you can't do those things. And politically, where those members of Congress have 2-year terms and they're relying on support to get reelected and they need money and so on, it's tough to sort of use the little power they have to pull those levers and to reel that in, when the president can use those sort of international conflicts to his advantage and use the bully pulpit to support his agenda and to carry those things out. And so there's just a lot of different, sort of push and pull and tug of war that's going on here. And I think it needs to be addressed. And I think it's going to have to come from the courts. I know there's a case coming up this summer where a decision is going to come out, Trump v. Slaughter. And that could have a huge impact on how much power the president has on like hiring and firing, major department heads and stuff like that. And that's just another modern example of the important things that are going on in administrative law, constitutional law, and how that stuff can shape our government, and then how that, impacts public policy and, our society.
In a bite-sized answer, this is probably a part A, part B, but
Yeah.
if the courts wanted to weigh in to apply the law in this situation, could they? And then I guess the part B is, if they were going to, how would they have to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously still in the infancy of learning of how that plays out at a high level. But based on my understanding of it now, I think they could definitely come out and they could return us to like the non-delegation era, to where Congress has to be very careful about how much power it gives to agencies. Things used to be like that before the New Deal era and before like sort of the Great Depression and FDR and all that stuff happened. Things used to be that way. It wasn't until, the Great Depression, World War II happens, where the courts started to allow for a more robust administrative and executive to sort of address those needs. And I get it. But I think from that, we have to realize that times change and politics evolves, and that maybe the court is overcompensating and sort of like overcorrecting. And so I think they could issue a ruling Um, the thing that's tough is I could just see it going either way. I could
Mm.
totally see executive power being expanded into where someone like Trump could have darn near total control of sort of the administrative state. And I don't even want to say Trump, just the president in general. But I could
Yeah.
totally see him using it to his advantage to sort of carry out his agenda. And there's also the argument that, look, the president is democratic elected. So why can't he carry out the agenda he was elected to do? I think that's a fair argument. But what I always say to people is, it's convenient when it's your party, when it's, your mascot on your jersey that's in the office that can use that power. But you might not be happy when it's the other team in there using that same power. So just take that into consideration. So that's how I approach it. But with that said, I do think the courts can issue new precedents. They've done it throughout history. And I think there's enough standing there where they could. They have the power of judicial review. They have the power of coming out and saying, this is what the Constitution says. And so this is how we should be operating. It's just a question of will they? Because the courts have become increasingly partisan as well. And that's something I don't think the founders could have conceptualized, not to this degree anyway. And so we're sort of stuck to deal with that ourselves now. And it remains to be seen how that plays out.
How exactly do you think we can change minds politically in 2026? Because, man, it feels like it's really difficult because it feels
Yeah.
like people are ideologically entrenched. And this is not just, a binary right and left. This is like all the different shades of gray in between. This is the libertarian groups. This is the moderates, this is everybody. Like everybody is from my perspective, ideologically entrenched in what they believe. How exactly do you change the minds and move the needle in any way in 2026? Because it feels like that's a really, really difficult thing to do.
Yeah. So I got a part A and B to that. The first is like at a macro level. I think there's a ton of research, a lot of great books and experts, psychologists, pollsters, the like, that there's a lot of good evidence out there. And a lot of it points to, and it seems cliche, is just talking to one another, but like listening. When people feel like you understand where they're coming from, there's also a great book called Good Arguments by Bo So. He was like a world champion debater. And one of the first sort of rules or steps into being a good debater is understand the other side's argument so that you can discuss with them, make quality counterpoints, find quality solutions or common ground, but really make a good faith effort to understand, okay, what matters to that person? Why does it matter? What issues are they worried about? And what are some areas that we can find common ground on? It seems, I get it. It seems cliche. It seems small, but it sort of gets put on the back burner because of, social media and us being inundated with information. And every day there's some new crises or something going on. And I don't think we were meant to be exposed to this amount of information at this sort of clip. And unfortunately, we're going to have to evolve with that, right now, quickly in real time. It remains to be seen how that plays out. But the second part is, I think we need to find a way that creates an incentive structure that encourages the best among us to seek public office, to seek content creation, to seek journalism, to return to academia. So we talked about earlier how I'm kind of like center right, but a moderate. People on my side, even in the middle these days, a lot of independents, they like to complain about academia, but they don't want to go to academia. They don't want to be a professor. They don't want to go to school. They complain about the schools, but they don't want to send their kids to public school. And look, I get that. Homeschooling is great. You get to be with your kids more. There's arguments, for and against that. But there's just this common trend of complaining about things, but then sort of evading it and staying away from it and going away from it and then complaining about how it's sort of deteriorating, but we're not taking an active role in it. And I think the political process is very much the same thing, where your average American is not voting. They're not plugged into what's going on. We have 45% are independents now. So unless a lot of people are being active and sort of registering for a party to be active in the primary, we have a majority of the electorate that's not active in the primary, that's picking the actual candidates that we end up voting for on election day. So we need good models again. And that's just one of the sort of philosophies that's encouraged me to get involved because I'm not perfect by any means, but I think I'm a good faith actor. I'm open minded. I'm getting educated on the right things. I have some experience and I'm gaining more. And I'm a good father. I'm a good husband. I'm just a good citizen. Um, I like to think about other people's perspectives, and I know I'm not alone. So I'm doing this in the hopes that I can encourage other people to get involved. For example, like a guy like a Jocko Willink, former Navy SEAL. He's a renowned podcaster. I respect him a lot. I would love to see someone like that run for office, but he wants nothing to do with that because he knows, in large part, it's kind of a scam the way the system is set up. It's not genuine. Um, there's a lot of it's pay to play. There's a lot of sort of Machiavellian actors. There's special interests at play. And so the best among us are not representing us, and we're paying for it, unfortunately. So those are kind of my two answers there is listen to the other side, have a true understanding of where they're coming from, have important discussions, and then hopefully let's try to get more good people involved. And that doesn't mean everyone needs to run for office or be a content creator, but get involved with your school board or do something in your community, get people registered to vote, stuff like that.
I think too, a small thing that someone can do is read and try and at
Yeah,
least
that's very
understand. There's the age old quote that reading is the best form of resistance, which, you can
oh,
take it
that's
or leave
good.
it. But I think it
Yeah,
is true to a certain extent that reading is, and it's not the act of reading, it's the result of reading. It is
right,
understanding, it's context, it's recognizing arguments and figuring them out. I think a lot of people just don't recognize arguments. A lot of people don't understand what populism is.
yeah,
And so, populism shoots up and everybody goes, "Wait, how did this happen?" And it's like, "Well, you didn't know what it was. You didn't
yeah.
recognize it." I think reading is probably something people can do and is probably one of the better things you can do if we're not going to run for office because I understand it. It is scary to get involved because it feels like it's a no-win game to get involved and be active in politics because the political system is so yeah, it's just fire and ice. It is cats and dogs in a lot of ways, and I think that filters down and people see a label that another person will adopt. And they'll go, well, that must mean that you agree with all these things that are reprehensible
Right,
because they've been fed all this
right.
stuff. They get on social
Yeah,
media and it's like, here's all the stuff you should be mad at. And they get mad about it.
yeah.
But I think reading, it makes it more difficult to be like, well, I'm just going to get mad about all of this stuff because you
It
get to
practices
see,
you. Yeah, it encourages you to practice nuance and to have
yeah,
perspective and especially when you're reading history because you really see how much things haven't changed, but how much they have at the same time, which seems paradoxical. But you just see consistencies in human nature, and that we've constantly been fighting about the same topics, and similar things have happened. And there's definitely that rhyme that we see, and I think that only comes from reading, right? And reading is different, especially when you have like a physical book, because
yeah,
it's a slower pace. You have time to think things through, sit on it, marinate on it, chew on it, and sort of apply it to your own life or things that you're seeing or things that you're worried about. That's not the same reading that you're doing on social media in the comment section or reading a headline on a carousel, right? And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people, most of their reading, that's what that entails. It's not the physical book. It's not just taking some time, letting your nervous system rest for a second, not jumping to conclusions, but just reading, learning new things, embracing nuance. And that only comes from reading. And that's something that's sort of it's a dwindling phenomenon, unfortunately. I think we need to return to that. We're throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to education, when it comes to reading, when it comes to just like the basic things that we used to uphold as a society. And it's funny, just me saying those things to some people, they're like, "Oh, those are right wing talking points. Those are far right." But I'm like, no, that's for everyone, right?
yeah.
That's for whether you're an American, whether you're Chinese, whether you're Russian, whether you're Canadian, whether you're a Democrat, a Maoist, a Marxist. Like, just read, consider different viewpoints, have discussions, be involved in your community. Those are just basic things we need to be doing. Technology is great, but if it consumes our whole life, it's going to consume our culture and our society. And I don't think it's going to be for the better. And that's what we're seeing now. So
To
yeah,
that
I think yeah.
to that end, what are a couple books you've read recently that have been really good?
Doris Kearns Goodwin, one of my favorite authors. She's writing leadership, and she wrote Leadership in Turbulent Times, Bully Pulpit, which is another one. That's a thick one, and sort of Teddy Roosevelt. But Leadership in Turbulent Times, that sort of outlines the life of FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon Johnson, and sort of the obstacles they overcame in life and what sort of leaders they became as a result of that and how they led and things that they did. So that's one of the main ones. Another one is War and Peace and War by Peter Churchin. I've made a couple of videos on that. That's something I'm still dissecting because he sort of covers, nations and empires. And I feel like we're seeing a lot of those cycles that he talks about sort of playing out now. And so, yeah, those are a couple I'm looking at. World Order by Henry Kissinger. That's another one because I think he is one of those thought leaders that is influential for the Reagan, the Bushes, the Trumps. And that's sort of the foreign policy that we're seeing carried out right now. That's not an endorsement of those beliefs, but I think just the reality is he is like emblematic of sort of the ideology that is fueling the politics and the diplomacy or lack thereof and foreign conflicts that are being carried out right now. And so those are some of the books that I'm reading to sort of just get a better idea of like executive leadership and foreign policy and stuff like that.
Dude, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I'll throw in there another couple as well. Team of Rivals, also by Doris Kearns Goodwin. If you hadn't read that, that's
I have not.
Yeah,
I've heard of it though. Yeah.
So good. I've got it open right here actually. It's about
Nice.
Lincoln's cabinet, and it's fascinating because of all the political infighting. His Secretary of State, well, nobody liked Lincoln at first. They thought he was a bum. And then he proved him wrong with a couple different policy decisions. And by like May or June 1861, everybody kind of gets on board. And then it's, this really tight-knit cabinet throughout the war. Another one is The Coming Storm by Oddar Westad, which is just about geopolitics and like hinge points in world politics, like India, Taiwan. I think it just released like a week or two ago.
Okay.
And I was lucky enough to get an early copy of it, and it's super cool. It compares it to World War I. It's really fun. If you like, depressing potential World War scenarios.
Right.
But I think it was really cool to understand, somebody who studies this stuff and says, okay, this is what this country cares about, and this is what this country cares about, and here's sort of how they approach geopolitics. But yeah, that's all I've got, man. Thank you so much for coming on. This was a blast. These kind of conversations, I think are really important. There was a lot of jargon. I'm going to try and, define some terms throughout the episode when I go back and edit it. But I think, these kind of conversations I think are really important to dive into just sort of a deeper layer of here's the stuff happening around us and here's sort of why it's happening. And some of the legislation and policy that's kind of causing it. So this is really fun. I think hopefully people are going to really enjoy it.
Yeah, I hope so too. It was an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. I tried to distill things and keep them as accessible as possible because I feel like that's an important part of communicating. So hopefully that came through. And I had a lot of fun. I mean, all these topics are super fascinating and super important. So it was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much, man.
Absolutely.